So we're in the space of doubt. We're finishing the Mishnah of Nazir, and we're going through a set of laws, a set of halachot that regulate spaces of doubt. They're linked by one expression, she raglaim ladavar, that the matter has legs. And the Mishnah interprets this broadly as saying, look, if there's a reasonable basis for making an assumption, we're going to make an assumption. Only if there's a reasonable basis. If yes raglaim ladavar, if the thing's got legs, there's a reasonable basis. Or we were dealing with a situation of someone who immerses himself in a lake which is in a cave, and he finds that there's a corpse there, buried under the lake. So is he unclean because of being in the same space as a corpse? Because the cave, of course, is like a tent. We were talking about the situation of someone who finds bones on his property. Does that mean that his house is actually on a graveyard with all kinds of implications? Well, again, it depends how many corpses he finds. And now we're going to shift into the area of negaim, of tsarat, of this strange skin disease that's described in Vayikra. And we're actually going to shift from this strange skin disease to questions of a mission, a genital emission, before going on finally to death. And that is essentially a liability for death. Liability for death. And that essentially is the subject matter of the fourth Mishnah in the 9th chapter. So it's very broad, and the link between these topics is not at all clear, except for the fact that they're all linked by the legal assumption we're going to make. And twice we're going to use the phrase raglaim ladavar, that the thing has legs. There's a reasonable basis for making an assumption. And maybe, I guess, we could learn something out from in terms of halakha or legal practice that, we do make assumptions, but we make assumptions based on facts. We don't just make random assumptions or prejudicial assumptions. We make assumptions which are based on facts. And Mishnah begins, Kol sfeik negaim katchila tahor. Any sfeik negaim, a nega in this context it's sarat, this weird skin disease. And we're talking about sfeik negaim, a weird skin disease which is in doubt. And of course, they're all in doubt at the beginning because someone shows up at the kohen to display his skin, and he'll have something on it he doesn't understand. But we're saying initially, just as we say that someone is innocent until proven guilty, someone is tahor until he's proved to be tameh. Someone's pure until he's proved to be impure. Kol sfeik negaim katchila tahor. Any doubtful affliction is clean at the outset. It starts off as tahor. It starts off as pure. Ad shelo nizkak latuma, until it's decided as impure. So we stay, it starts off as tahor. Misha nizkak latuma sfeiko tameh. Once it's decided as unclean, that then becomes our core assumption. So with any matter of doubt, if we then don't know what the situation is, well, the starting assumption is it's unclean, it's tameh. So once it's decided as tameh, once it's decided as unclean, it needs a real fact, not a doubtful fact, to push it back into clean. In other words, it's assumed to retain its previous state. And having introduced this idea, the Mishnah then goes on to talk about a zav. The halakha of zav comes in the 15th chapter of Vayikra. Of Vayikra, just after the halakha of the tsarat, of this weird skin disease. So maybe there's a mental connection there. And we need a verse. Let me just show you the verse. The verse is from Vayikra, chapter 15. Dabru al b'nei Yisrael v'amartam alehem. Speak to the people of Israel, say to them, Ish yezav mi b'saro. When someone has a zav, has an omission, it's translated here as issue. It's some kind of omission. Yezav mi b'saro zovo tamehu. His issue, his omission is unclean. We're not talking here, we're talking about here about a genital omission, but not semen. So we're talking about a genital omission, but it's some infectious omission. I mean, the fact that it's infectious maybe is reflected in the fact that we shut this guy up out of account. And most modern doctors associate this with today's disease of gonorrhea. It's some kind of diseased emission coming out of the genitals. It's tameh, and we need to see it 2 or 3 times in order to determine what it really is. Once is a doubtful omission, twice is certain, and 3 times we're going to bring a korban, we're going to bring a chatata, a sin offering, when we're clean. And in fact, we learned in Mishnah and Megillah, talking a little bit about this counting. And the Mishnah and Megillah says, Ein bein zav haro'eh shtei rayot l'ro'eh shalosh eila korban. The only difference between a zav who sees it twice and one who sees it 3 times is the sacrifice. I.e., once we see it twice, we're pretty certain we've got an omission. But if we see it 3 times, we need to bring a sacrifice. And that will have an impact on our chain of assumptions and chain of reasoning. So now let's go back to our Mishnah. B'sheva derachim bodkim et hazav. We're going to check a zav in 7 ways before we decide it as unclean. So we're going to follow the facts, we're going to examine the zav. And we're anxious that this emission, this thing which is oozing out of him, maybe it's not a gonorrheal emission at all. Maybe it's being created by something else entirely. I mean, for example, if it's a sexual emission, it's not a zav. A zav is non-sexual. And the rabbis had a view that there were 7 things that could create these sorts of emissions which were not, well, what we would call today gonorrhea, which was not this diseased infection. And that's why the Mishnah is going to say, so we're going to check for these 7 things. Until we determine that it's tameh, until we determine it's impure. But with food, that Maimonides, who is a doctor, says there's all kinds of food like meat and oil that can make you generate this sort of emission. B'mishteh, with drink, there are some kind of drinks that can make you generate. B'masa, carrying heavy loads around. Bikfitza, jumping. B'choli, you might be ill. And of course, we think of gonorrhea as a sickness here, but the Mishnah is thinking about a different kind of sickness. B'mar'eh, which you see now, and here we are getting into the sexual domain. If you see a beautiful woman, you can have an emission. if you're a man, but this is not the kind of emission. This is not the zav. That's a sexual emission. It's not a zav. It's not what we're looking for. Over here, hur, and thinking. When the Mishnah talks about here, hur, or thinking, it's talking about a sexual fantasy. It's not talking about just any kind of force. So we're going to check the zav in case any of these 7 things have happened. And of course, as a matter of assumption, we are assuming he's clean to start off with until he's proved as unclean. And if any of these 7 things have happened, then he remains clean. He remains tahor. But once we've established that he's tameh, and this is after the 2nd check, after he's seen this twice. Once we've established that he's unclean, we don't check him anymore. In other words, the 3rd time round, we just assume it's a continuation of the 2nd time round. And that is essentially the sense of our Mishnah in Megillah. There's no difference between a zav who sees it twice and one who sees it 3 times, except the sacrifice. The only difference is the sacrifice. We're not going to do a third examination if he sees it 3 times. So once uncleanness is established, we actually stop checking the guy. Here's our key phrase, the matter has legs. Once we've established he's unclean, so we've established he's got with 2 sightings, then anything else which would normally not count as an emission, on sos fekor, something that happened beyond his control, i.e. the disease, us fekor, something in doubt, v'shifrat zaror, a regular emission of seed. All of these are considered tameim. They're all considered impure, like the zav, like the emission of the zav, because there's a basis for the matter. That's the law of the zav. We check twice, we check carefully, and then we assume when he sees the 3rd time that he is unclean, sees it a 3rd time, he has to bring korban. That's the 2nd example the Mishnah will bring. But there are 3. And the Mishnah now goes on to liability for personal injury or death. Hamakeh et chavero. Someone strikes his fellow. Ve'amduhu lamita, and they expect him to die. And then he improves. So we're expecting this guy to die. This is a halacha actually from the Torah, I think, some in Mishpatim. So we read this to last Shabbat. Someone strikes his fellow. They expect him to die. But then he gets better. After that, he gets worse and he dies. So he recovers and he gets worse and then he dies. Hayav. The Mishnah rules Hayav. That means he's actually liable for the death of this person he's hit. In other words, his death is considered to be the result of the blow that he received. And Rabbi Nehemiah is going to disagree. By the way, the halacha goes according to Rabbi Nehemiah. Rabbi Nehemiah poter she raglayim ladavar. Rabbi Nehemiah disagrees because the thing has legs. There is a basis for the matter. So Rabbi Nehemiah is saying, and maybe this is influenced by the fact that liability for murder or manslaughter is, of course, a serious liability. Rabbi Nehemiah is going to exempt because he's saying, look, this guy has recovered or has begun to recover. If then he gets worse and falls sick and dies, we can assume that we cannot necessarily apply a direct chain of reasoning to the original blow. I mean, really interesting use of the word sheraglaim ladavar. The thing has legs, because what Rabbi Nehemiah is really saying is the thing doesn't have legs. We cannot establish a bulletproof, a shatterproof, logical chain of events from the death of this person who was struck, who was sick, who then got better, and then who died. We can't establish a logical train of events from this to the death, and therefore the striker is not liable for his death. I mean, he would be liable, of course, for simple damages, but not for his death.